All right, so thank you very much for coming and inviting me. I'm Leon, and I am a creative technologist. And I would like to talk about the hypermediatic experience. It's an experience which basically doesn't exist because I just made it up. Uh, Hypermediatic is sort of the term I sort of created because I realized that hypermedia was a bit um, perhaps a bit old fashioned, and I didn't really get it when I was researching it. So I thought, realizing its potential along the way, I thought maybe let's just add some three characters, hypermediatic, to sort of give my interpretation of everything I found out. And perhaps it should be called HyperX, as in mentioned in the by Vint, I think. So it might be a similar thing. So I was sort of going, I was experimenting with trying to redefine hypermedia by looking through the lens of XR. Like it's really easy to go from text to hypertext and to sort of realize what we have now on the web, but it's not so easy to imagine how we could reason from XR, where we have a 3D space, and how that sort of um, follows back into text. So yeah, this is my experiment to reason backwards. So basically, from what we have now, what we can do now, and also the realities which we have now, because we not only have physical reality, we have a sort of written reality. These things can be totally different, as you know, with all history writing. History is written by the victors usually. So, anyways, I really enjoyed this actually to sort of not be locked into a certain historical opinions, so to speak. So one of the questions I had, like, which came first, text or images? And I didn't really get a good answer when I started to research history. It was a bit of a rabbit hole. Like you can, it's almost the same, and the same with like which came first, hypertext or hypermedia. I also asked this in a previous presentation, and this was also a bit fuzzy for me how this was all presented historically. Historically, it seems a bit like hypermedia was added after hypertext. So, anyways, for me, the answer was almost like through a symbolic lens, they appear to be the same, these things. Through the XR lens, they also seem to appear to be the same. So, hypermedia would be something you would consume in XR and not necessarily through hypermedia. Uh, I'm not sure if that makes sense. But anyways, here's again the traditional sort of hypermedia explanation, how it's different from hypertext. To me, I found it a bit weird that the hypertext can link infinitely. Every hypertext document can link to another one. And for some reason, hypermedia is explained as some kind of like one outbound link, but the image itself has no links inside them to link to another image, which is a bit weird because if you look at a comic book, you would imagine to load one, for example, in XR, you would imagine one big um, sort of tile of a comic book, clicking on it and going to the next one or something. So for some reason, this didn't really happen, or I haven't really experienced it with hypermedia. And the same way with videos, all these videos, images, audio, they seem to be endpoints rather than hyper connected entities. So that was a bit weird to me. So, um, so through the lens of reality to text synthesis, so basically going from trying to describe your reality in text is a sort of synthesis. And the same as I'm trying to look in XR, like how can I synthesize this XR reality to some kind of text? Just like HTML is also a sort of synthesis of some kind of experience. Um, So I came up with this, I started to play with this concept, which is basically a concept from synthesizers. Like this is a really, like one of the first synthesizers were basically a carrier signal and a modulator signal. And that, when added together, creates a sort of synthesis, which creates a new sound, something which is more beautiful and recognizable. And in this way, we could see the URL as a sort of textual carrier, which then is modulated. It carries HTML, and the hypermedia is sort of modulating the HTML. So you have like this almost, it's almost a text synthesizer, which then finally synthesizes some text on the screen with some images and pixels. And but many times I found I got this feeling like it's not really hyper connected. And now, for example, this sort of fan out pattern, this is a bit like what hypertext is today. We have just a document, and it's sort of fans out to maybe some pictures, movies, but that's it. Like you cannot go further, and you're sort of locked into clicking another hyperlink. So you cannot really serve images. You cannot really serve audio. So on the right, the two ones on the right would be something more hyper connected. So I started to play with this idea that maybe the real sort of killer app of the web, of hypertext and all these things, maybe it's just the URLs. Maybe it's just the textual URLs which are modulating with each other's and not so much locked into the sort of HTML paradigm. It's almost as if the HTML is sort of locking in this hyperlinks and the hyper connectivity. So yeah, I started to play with this idea that maybe it's just text modulating with text, where the URL is sort of the metro, the transport. It teleports our text from our brain to somebody else's brain. And the hypermedia could actually be anything, could also be a 3D object. So if everything would link to everything, so everything is an object, and we're not really thinking in terms of hypertext linking to hypertext, then I started to realize that TikTok and YouTube, they are great video databases, hypermedia-like, but not really hypermediatic. Again, this is just something I made up, because I can still not click a table inside a video, or I cannot click on a person in a podcast. And there's like everything is not like the user curated web rings of the web, the beginning. No, it's sort of like algorithm curated. So the users have not so much control of what will be the next video, etc. So I was thinking for this hypermediatic XR synthesis, which I was thinking about, the waves, that the textual public carrier seems to be the URL. And this is basically what I said a slide ago. Since we're on short time, I'm gonna speed up. How much time do we have?
Yes, you're almost done.
Okay, so so in a more high level way, I was thinking of the URL is almost a sort of textual time space encoding decoding, because these are, if you really boil it down to the basics, the stuff we share and the stuff the applications share with each others to sort of compress and decompress everything we think or model in 3D modelers. So last but not least, I want you to get totally drunk on URLs as I have became McLuhan style. So I was thinking maybe the URL is the message. Maybe HTML is just a hypertext media format, a great one, but just a text media format. Similar way, the web browser is just an app. We have seen so many apps appear, and I think maybe we should sort of like depart a bit of the web browser is sort of the app. Now it's just an app. The same for the HTTP protocol. And yeah, I think if we just sort of try to take a step back, then there are possibly very nice opportunities to also look at the operating system and the apps, all the apps of the operating system as a sort of browser. So my last thing what I want to say is that there are some opportunities where we can sort of get the protocols, get the file formats, and get the views from what browsers have been doing for years, and sort of pull them more into our apps, all the apps. It doesn't matter which app store, or our operating systems. Maybe on Linux distros, this would be a bit easier to do. But I think if we look at it that way, there is not so much a battle between the web browser and sort of app stores apps. If we just think in terms of apps being browsers and operating being browsers, like that, the app stores can just exist. We don't have to have a battle with them. They're there, but we have an option to just connect our apps with each other's and their data using URLs. This is a small video of a spec I'm working on, which is basically spatial URLs for the URLs, where you can basically reference, just like the presentation before, you can reference a fragment, a piece of 3D, and sort of, I think you call it transclude. And you can basically transclude it into another 3D document. So maybe we should have a talk actually. And this
is.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot for that. And this, I think, this will be the end of the video. Allows us to really use this teleporting power of the URL, and this sort of authorship, or I don't know how you call it. So let me go. Oh yeah, this is by the way my the XR fragment spec in sort of in action, where the whole 3D scene has been collapsed to an XR word graph, which is text. So we went from complete 3D spatial to text, and which allows associations to be drawn, visible links, that if you click on a cube, you can see the hash cube appears in the URL, and the visible links start to appear with anything cube related. If it's a button which does something with a cube, or it's an image, or it's another 3D document embedded which has a cube, all these things can be sort of shown, the relationship. So thank you very much, and any questions, welcome.
First, an obvious question, and then over to Dave. What happens with the domain part of this? You know, domains die. So how does that function then when you change domain or something goes down?
That depends on the publisher. This XR fragment spec is basically it's protocol agnostic, so it means it can work with any protocol. If you're very serious and worried about this, you have to choose something like IPFS. If you're not so worried about this, or you want to be more EU right to be forgotten, or just basically, or if you just want to be more lazy, you just go for HTTP. You upload something to on another protocol.
Can you just stop sharing the screen so we can see it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, that was really, really good. Thank you very much. So this is sort of more of a comment really, and to answer some of the questions you raised. So I think we tend to look at hypertext today through the lens of the web, because it became such a dominant hypertext platform. If you go pre-web, you find loads of really interesting work on this space. So the place I would go is probably Open Hypermedia Systems, not in the open as in open source or open as in free, but open in that what they did is they take the hypertext structure and they separate it entirely from content. And that meant that the hypertext systems of the 90s, so Dave's over there, Microcosm, for example, allowed you to take arbitrary content, like a video, and apply hypermedia on top of it. So microcosm, when that was 91, was it 90? So that would allow you to play a video, follow a link in the video to an audio file,
Really?
follow a link in the audio file to a Word file, etc., images. It was all completely hyperlinked.
You can still run it.
And you can still run it. So so really have a look at Open Hypermedia. They're really interesting.
Open hyperlink.
Open hypermedia systems.
Open hypermedia.
But it gets better, right? Because one of the things you do if you take the hypermedia structure away is you can take the same content, and you can take an alternative hypermedia structure and put it on top, right? So that leads you to an adaptive hypermedia system where different people can have different combinations of hypertext structure and get personalized hypertext views completely independently of the content, right?
Interesting.
And then it gets better again, right? Because you can say, well, link structures is one type of content, one type of structure, but there are alternative structures like spatial hypertext structure, taxonomic hypertext structure, those kinds of things. So you can have systems which manage that and overlay that over the same time, or do that simultaneously. And there was a whole area of work called component-based open hypermedia systems, where the components were essentially a structure server, a link server, and those kind of, and you dynamically combine them. And then this all accumulated, I think, in a movement called structural computing, which was to say, this is so fundamental, we should push it down into the operating system layer, so that these are hypermedia services that are operated, given to us by the operating system. So this is all work that was kind of, I guess, from 90 through to about 2004 or 5. And around that time, what happened is that the web was just crushing this work, right? So there was so much emphasis on the web. Mid 2000s, you get the Web 2 revolution, and suddenly some of the benefits of those kinds of systems you now start to see on the web. And I think that's basically the final death knell, right? And that's what, so when I say you see some of these ideas resurfacing, that's what I mean. It feels like the web tsunami has passed and we're at the other side and able to think about these things again. And I'm sure Dave's got some to add as well, but just a final thought. So when I look at XR environments, I look at the perfect open hypermedia environment again. I don't think of hypertext embedded in the 3D objects. I think of it as connections and associations which are held separately to content and dynamically combined at runtime to create me a personalized interlinked experience in the XR space. Right? And that's kind of like a modern manifestation of it. That's what I'd love to see that. Right, sorry, that was a lot of stuff.
No, that's good stuff.
Yeah. Brilliant. Very, very briefly, that was a fantastic. Dave Giroux, University of Oxford. That was a brilliant summary. So that period, absolutely, we were working on open hypermedia. I got to tell you the question you should ask Dave. So we is exactly what we've been describing. It was great having the link structures separate because you could apply different structures to the same content, or you could bring along new content and it would be linked up automatically. It was amazing. I was working in music. I still work in music. I want to talk about that at some point. But that works really, really well. When we started trying to tell the web community how to do this, and we wrote papers about the first web conference as a paper about this, but not in the proceedings because we weren't telling people wanted to hear about the web, not about another system. So there's a period where the open hypermedia sort of discourse got somehow suppressed by the web. What's really exciting this morning is we've seen two presentations that absolutely have gone back to that world. So here's a question you could ask me and Dave. Why didn't it catch on? If it's better, why didn't it catch on? And we should see what Dave has to say. But my easy answer to that, I think, is it required that much more engineering. As soon as you store the linked data structures separate to the documents, you needed some more sophistication in the systems. And there was, even though it gave you link integrity, you had to do more work to get there. And the web came along, and we looked at Tim's first web browser demo, and we said, that's too simple, that'll never catch on. And the rest is history. So it's simplicity of the web, and the fact that people didn't expect link integrity. But now, what you just demonstrated this morning is with current technologies, made with that engineering, is absolutely accessible now. So back to Dave.
So that's exactly my answer as well. So I was going to say that what people, I think looking back on it, what people didn't realize was it's that killer app thing, right? It's like so the web did something. It did lots of things terribly, right? But it did one thing brilliantly, which was scale, right? And none of these systems scaled at all well, right? So the web came along and it said, actually, if you throw out all of this stuff, if you throw out disconnected structure, if you throw out version control, if you throw out kind of link integrity, or get rid of all of that stuff, you can scale. And we all went, well, that's terrible because you're just throwing out all the great stuff, right? And the web said, but we don't care because now we have 100 million users, right? And I think that that's the key thing. And actually, your system is the first time I've seen a genuine alternative, scalable infrastructure to the web that has the potential to deliver all of the things that were available in the more centralized desktop systems of the 90s. Right? Yeah. So, but my concern, and I suppose part of my question, part of my concern, and one of the things behind my question was how do you deal with the commercial and social reality that we now have the web and the walled gardens and the apps and all that kind of stuff. And one of the interesting things about the XR space, I think Frody made this point as well, is it kind of gives you this fresh canvas where we don't have all of these kind of embedded interests anymore. And you could say, actually, there's the space to do this in a different way. So I think the kind of combination of these and in that space, that's has really exciting potential. But yeah, fundamentally, it's taken 30 years to see it, right? And there were attempts. I'm thinking like the distributed link service, and playing around with proxies, and there was the dubious work around Xlink and all that kind of stuff, right? But it just kind of, like you said, over engineering. It didn't have the simplicity and the understandability of the web. That's how I put it.
Interesting.
I have comments and questions too, just so you know. So when just on the beginning on the whole thing with the links, Doug Engelbart's system, as you know, was very constrained, very organized, very hierarchical. And then we started discussing the idea of using the links to put commands into. So we did things like the view spec would be in the URL. So to see this, not extension, but this vastness of using the link. I mean, when you have a node with a graph with connections and nodes, you could always reverse it to what's the connection and what's the node, right? I think you are really putting something very interesting on that. And I also just want to highlight the super importance of A, addressability, and B, things being able to say what they are. So the thing that I've been working on that you know super well, visual meta, it just says, this is a thing, and this is what it is. That's all it is. And that allows any system to come in and use it, right? And then the other thing, when you were showing the collapsing of the addressability. So I've stopped the clock. Fabian, who's left the room now, he's going to be after lunch, but I think if all of us can think a little bit more on this notion now before lunch, because this is an opportunity to bring voice back. This is an opportunity to really, like Dave just said, use the XR as an excuse to rethink things. I really hope someone else has some questions or comments.
Well, this is really tied up with what this like last sentence that you just said is really tied up with what Vince said before, that when they are creating the internet, there are no commercial incentive, so they had it pretty easy to do what they did. And right now, as I'm very new to XR and all that, but I assume that it's now in that's the free space right now. Like we are in that area that there's no too much commercial incentive. There's no too much like constraints around that medium that helps people that are working in this area like just spark more ideas and better solutions, right? So and like tied up with what we're trying to do, one of the things that I really like about this project, this system, is the choice that we're trying to bring back people's more choice to do what they really want to do, and not tied up with all this different systems that you need to comply in order to share, in order to do whatever you want to do. So it's very interesting. So it was not a question, just a remark.
Leon, do you want to say more about how this approach can be used? Or what is the thing that you didn't get to say that you have some more time? What do you really want to wave the flag about?
I want everybody. Oh, now it already sounds a bit too much. But like, I think like forget about everything I'm working on. I think if everybody, developers, game developers, web developers, if they just realize that every entity in a 3D document is an opportunity to create a unique URL. So it's addressable by default. So you don't have to, sort of come up with a URL. No, it's like if you just realize that everything inside a 3D document has a URL already, then that is a great basis of sort of transcluding and referencing, addressing objects in various ways. Just a small example. If you have a 3D object with a sky, a sky, clouds, and you are already in a 3D document, then it's really easy to just reference this document one child below the sky, because everything is hierarchical. The sky is the sort of outer parent entity, and you only have nested 3D entities in them. So if you just if you're able to reference that document one level below the sky, then you can include 3D documents into 3D documents without having multiple skies or something, because you only need one. I hope that makes sense. But that's a sort of revelation I got when looking through the lens of 3D objects. Yeah.
That is so perfect as an example. So you and I watched a bit of Hamilton yesterday. Levy watched it the night before. And if you don't know Hamilton, what are you doing in this room? Anyway, there's a great beginning, one of the first, when Aaron Burr is really mad at Hamilton because he keeps rising through the ranks. One of the lyrics is, he changes the game, right? And when you're a game designer in a computer game, your gameplay is called the meta, right? So when people are talking about the meta of gaming, that's what they're talking about. Of course, we're talking about metadata here, and it's something that just people instantly generally just turn off. But metadata is the data that makes the data know what the data is. So if we change the metadata, we are the ones changing the game. I'm just trying to paraphrase what you're saying. If it is known in an open system where things are and what they are, stuff can happen. It's like we're going from single-celled organisms of the web into eukaryotes who can spontaneously combine. So it's a beautiful illustration of what can happen.
Exactly. And small note, also metadata in the sense that it's already in there. You don't need to add it yourself. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word metadata, they think like, oh, I have work to do or I have to do something. But these days we have such rich file formats that there is already so much structure and data in there that we don't have to worry about that anymore.
Actually, do you want to start? Very quick. Sorry, we still have to use the special chat.
The special chat. Very quick one to pick up on the last. Sorry, it's Mark Anderson. Just thinking about this fact. Actually, one of the things I'm just looking at in a sort of large academic funding, basically infrastructure for data, is that actually there is a problem with metadata, because the metadata we need is the very metadata the system can't provide for us. So it can tell us what that object is. It doesn't tell us why we made the object or what our thought or purpose is. And often that's the very thing. It's the very thing we want to ask questions about. And is the nexus of, for instance, why some of the current AI toys aren't as great as we thought they'd be. We can talk to them, but they can't tell us anything meaningful because all they ever see is the finished process, because we haven't exposed our thinking and our construct through metadata. It's not an easy problem. I don't claim to have an answer, but I now think in terms of meaningful metadata as opposed to metadata, because it's metadata all the way down is another problem. So you pass through several levels of it, but I mean there are some things that we don't capture at the moment, and is a challenge for our making of tools, which is something that deals explicitly with the problem you mentioned, where someone says, so I now have to describe this, and they turn off. So a challenge for us all is to find ways to capture that. I think that's Liz talk earlier. Yes, because when we use new tools, new opportunities, we have to let some things behind. But one of the things we're going to have to grapple with is, I don't think at the moment our tools can tell us why we did things, and that's one of the very things we want to know.
This is a good point.
Yeah, it was just a quick comment about addressability and your. So I think you have to be a little bit careful, because one of the things that people used to worry about was, how do you address the destination or the source of relationships and links? And I'm trying to remember what it was called, but people used to talk about location specifications as a thing. And the point is that isn't just a piece of metadata, it could be a process. So you may not want to say it's, so I may want to link to everything that is blue, right? Or I might want to have something more complex. So so I was in Rome for hypertext. So when I came back, I naturally watched the film Gladiator. So I might want to say, here's a link to Russell Crowe in Gladiator. And what I mean by that is, every occurrence, every time Russell Crowe is in a scene in Gladiator, which is most of it, but is in a scene in Gladiator. But that's a computational process. It's not something that's already there. And I need to be able to have a way of kind of linking to that process that then dynamically resolves to something, right? Or you might even think about 3D spaces that change, like virtual world spaces. So every time I follow that link, I may get a different resolution, because there's the space has changed or people have changed. So there are places in here where we may want to have processes rather than fixed specifications, I suppose.
That's why it's perfect, because a URL can be a query,
Yes, yep,
right?
Exactly. Well,
but you don't get them for free, is the point.
I would gladly send you the spec, because I think you would really have some good comments on it. Or maybe I will cry afterwards. I don't know. But
Or both. All right.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm on the mentor team. And my question is, while we're talking about addressability in a space, you imply that there's like a hierarchy that's like built into the 3D world, like how the sky, and so like I feel like that's part of some unspoken schema that is actually specific to the document that you're talking about, the 3D document that you're talking about. And to use a quick thought experiment, let's talk about the 3D document that we are all sharing right now, right? Like, how would you address in an absolute way something like a physical object that's in this room? Like, is there a strategy that it doesn't rely on some pre-baked schema that's already on the file?
yes, that's a good question. I found actually in the spec I've created, there's actually two ways. First of all, you have to realize that I found out that every 3D object has objects in them with a name already. There is a name. Sometimes it's computer generated, sometimes it's manually, like this could be name table, or it could be name X1.
We've named all of the elements that we've discovered in our universe. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you could do is, like, you could just sort of reference if you you could sort of reference this table, that you sort of include the link to this table, which is hash table, and then you would get everything about the table and what is inside the table. You could even sort of like teleport yourself in between this space. I don't know why you would, but maybe you're like, no, I also want more. So you could also if it's well designed hierarchically, you could just sort of reference the walls, and then you're at least sure that you have the table. And if there's some objects in there which you don't like, you're like, no, that's way too much. There's always, you can add a query in the URL. You can say minus chair, minus this person. You could exclude some stuff, or if well, it's a bit of a mix. Like, if you want to query more efficiently, we could sort of tag you, just like in HTML you have class, and with style sheet you can sort of,
It's a shorthand.
yeah, sure. And you could sort of exclude all the persons in the room, all the chairs, and you could sort of, or you could,
But
yeah. So
you need some schema that like tells like the reader that, you know, I'm a person, because maybe they don't understand and I'm just matter in the room. But anyways,
Yeah.
that takes the
That-
metaphor
that-
all
that's
pretty
a-
far,
that's a good-
like outside
yeah.
of the actual 3D file.
But the great thing, I have to admit, I'm sort of Freud. Freud has inspired me to sort of stay away from becoming too specific, which I also started to look at BibTeX versus, for example, RDF.
Mhm.
And I started to think like, well, if the HTML is the simple version, which sort of, you know, was good enough for us, then I started to realize like this BibTeX, which is just saying this points to that, like this kind of sort of non-specific thinking. I kind of like, it was also a great escape hatch for me to not worry too much about what it really is.
Yeah.
So it's more like a sort of like semantical soup, and it's sort of like the person has to make some sense out of it himself.
Yep.
So I do have to agree that is to make really sense out of it. That is really tough. That is really tough.
I'll come into this. Can I have
Yeah,
a quick? So they're coming in to set up for lunch any second now or for a minute. So many years ago, I got a phone call from Martin King, who's the guy who invented T9 texting. Do you remember that on the old physical phones? You would predictive texting. And he asked me to take any book off my bookshelf, open to any page and read one sentence, and then told me the name of the book. You used Google Books for that search. And his point was that English language is complicated enough that any sentence other than the most basic hello and something people wouldn't ever want to cite, they are unique enough to where the data becomes the address, right? And that, I think you're referring to that, and that is so amazing. So if you're talking about a human being in that example, it depends who wants to know. Because if it's for another human being, then the attributes that make you are relevant. If it's a clothing manufacturer, they're only going to care about the shirt, literally, right? So by describing the elements and making the elements the way you get to it is similar to what Mark and I were talking with Chris Guttridge a lot at Southampton, which is addressability shouldn't be one thing. You know, for you to give someone else the Groucho Club, you said 49 Dean Street, you can say exit the tube, take a left and a right. You know, you can ask someone on the way, which is why the notion of process is so important. So it's the same with locating something. And if you get to a point where the system isn't sure, that's okay. As long as you know the level of fuzziness that you are addressing with it, you can either interact with it some way or not. I just think the data becoming the address is just fantastic. And any other things, because I'm about to say something for the break for lunch.
What about subtext? So this, I might be using completely wrong vocabulary. This is great data. What about, so if you think back about writing notes, I very intentionally just thinking about 2 years ago, I was like, why not to give them personality? Because there's so much that you can say without sentences.
And
And
that's
that doesn't happen in this context. So you lose a lot. If this is where we're going, how do we not about the data environment by stopping?
you don't throw any data out because first of all, metadata can be inherent and it can be administrative and descriptive. It can be all kinds of data, right? But if you look at Nayana's presentation on the orality, you know, what is the metadata there? Is it the room it was in? Is it the time? Is it the intonation? The intonation is really important too. But also, like when we watched Hamilton last night, he writes a letter to Angelica, who is his sister-in-law, and he adds a comma between my dearest and Angelica, right? Changes the meaning. That is subtext, right? I mean, what AI system would necessarily care about that, right? So you can still put it in. And also, I do think that voice will come back a lot more. Livia, I agree with you, a lot more. I also think that handwriting will really have a resurgence now that systems can interpret that much better. So we will have to choose what we want to have in
Lost generations.
So I was just going to say, I think it's worth making a distinction between metadata that is in the data and you're just pulling it out so it's machine readable, and metadata that isn't in the data. And I think you're talking about the problem of saying, if you're pulling out metadata that's in the data, what about the stuff that's there that you haven't pulled out and you ignore it? Of course, it is still there in the data. You're only doing that for an engineering reason. So you can, yeah, I think it's worth thinking about it in those different
It
senses.
goes back to what you capture or what you choose not
Yeah.
to capture.
And what's inherent. So expecting them to come barging through the door. So this is a piece of obsidian, not the software. They're very, very, very hardware. And I bought this summer in Syracuse, volcanic Sicily and all of that stuff, because it fits so incredibly well in my hand. And that was really, really odd. I'm going to pass it around like we're in a school class or something. So the point of it is the folds of it, the way it naturally cuts, as I say, it fits this so well. And so I was wondering about that. We've been using that for longer than we've been humans by basically an order of magnitude, like more than 1 million years rather than humans, what, 200,000 years? So then there is the research that shows that maybe our tools shaped our hands, which is kind of neat, right? Because we were Homo habilis before we were Homo erectus. We started using tools before we were standing up. And the reason I want to hammer that in your heads is because the tools we invent now will shape the minds of every human after us. I just cannot bang the importance of the technicality. Who cares? It'll be high resolution faster. But the first steps in what we choose to do in this space, it's the last time in history we aren't using it. In the future, no one will have the benefit of our orality. When you talked about orality, you were also reflecting on orality for people who don't know how to read and write, being different from speech by someone who doesn't need to know how to read and write. In 10, 20 years, no one will have the benefit of not knowing what a headset is.
Look at the influence of HTML on this conversation. Technology. And getting around that is tremendously difficult.
Yeah.
When you say no one will have the benefit of not knowing, does that mean that's good or bad? It doesn't make it?
I think it's inevitable more than anything. I'm more of a light McLuhanite in the sense that technologies change how we think, but level of how deeply and how much it's going to happen. We might as well keep it in mind. A lot of technologies, opportunity when it goes up will equally go down. The opportunity for crap. So we have to take more ownership of it. Ownership.
So we need to have a big question about what's the future of society.
And that's why we need to have a bigger discussion of who should be in this community and communities like it. Doug Engelbart had this notion of an improvement community, but there would be many, and there would be networked improvement communities. We're all here parts of lots of different things. Just try to make the overlap and the dialogue more. So yeah, very provocative ending. So yeah, let's break for lunch, and thank you everyone. So online people, we will be back in an hour, but we'll leave one camera going. Thank you everyone. Thank you. Stop this one. Stop recording.
In the
Pause recording.
in the